we're going to have Alexa present about QA.
Everybody's favorite topic. So, hello everyone. This is my presentation, Right-Size QA, Scaling QA for a Small Studio. So, about me, I'm Alexa. Here's a picture of me and my cat. So, I got into games in 2019 with no background in QA or development. So, I actually was a printing press operator before this. I worked in trades. And I was also the first QA hire at a studio that had no QA process, and we had 2 big games coming out in early access, and they needed testing very badly. So yeah, I was Brace Yourself Games' first QA hire. I do need to acknowledge that this talk was originally written for a QA conference earlier this year that happened right before they laid off half my studio. So some of the stuff in here is maybe not super accurate to how it is nowadays. And I also need to say that this is going to be a very QA-focused presentation as well. So if anything is confusing, there will be time at the end for questions. We can talk about QA-specific spec at the end. But yeah, let's get into it. So here's our overview for today. So I'll just go through these quickly. So have a plan, but be ready to change the plan, growing and nurturing your QA team, outsourcing the smart way, and stretching your time and resources, and finally, making quality everyone's problem. All right, so having a plan, but being ready to change the plan. Got a couple points here. So for QA, you want to write test cases, but don't overdo it. So relying on a single strategy for testing is not sustainable or smart. When I first started, because I had no experience, there was no process, so I just tested randomly and logged bugs randomly, super disorganized. Then I found out about test cases, and I got really into maintaining a test case database, which was very difficult and complicated for our super small team. And it made it difficult because spec for incoming and existing features was constantly shifting, which made testing very time consuming. Between projects, though, you'll need to be ready to throw it all out and reuse what you can. So when you're at a growing studio, development strategy is constantly in flux. Everyone else is also learning what works and what doesn't. On different projects, you're going to have to adapt different methods of development. Sometimes you'll need to heavily tweak your process from one project to the next. And keeping a few things is absolute standard practice between projects. For me, this was ticket flow, so this is the exact same thing on every single project now. Part of plans changing is staying in sync with the development teams. So that being said, you need to be friends with your development teams as QA. So diplomacy and empathy are key. You need to meet teams where they're at. Don't push for, sorry, wait, I lost my spot. Diplomacy and empathy are key. If you treat developers with respect, they will also in turn respect you. Some devs don't have great relationships with QA, but if you extend the olive branch to them, they will do so in return. You also need to understand that developers are under unique pressures as well. So they're still people, they're still dealing with difficulties as well. You need to meet teams where they're at, so don't push for process that's causing friction. At one point, I wrote a lot of QA reports that no one read because they were really boring. And finally, I just stopped writing them because no one was reading them, and I decided to present my findings at team meetings once a week instead, which worked way better. We actually got things done that way. And finally, you need to be flexible but firm. So you are the testing expert, not them. Someone else's testing emergency is not always your testing emergency, so stay the course if your other testing priorities are more important, but try to help them in the right direction without throwing your entire schedule into chaos. This means not letting programmers expedite testing tasks directly to testers, so they should talk to you first. Training your testers to resist that as will help, so let's talk about growing and nurturing your QA team. So it's important to hire all-rounders for QA, especially at a small studio. Adaptability is a really valuable trait. The people you hire will be on your team for the foreseeable future. So they'll be experiencing the chaos of an evolving studio. You need people who are fairly easygoing that can absorb changes without too much difficulty. I like to hire based on a few key factors like communication ability, attention to detail, and, this is important, actual interest in QA as a discipline instead of as a stepping stone. However, when you hire, try to match your testers to projects where they will actually stay engaged. So part of the reason why people don't stay in QA is because it's not very much fun if you're just testing super boring stuff. So in interviews, I like to take note of what my candidates are interested in and try to match them to projects that they'd like. So for example, one of my testers was a speedrunner. So we stuck her on a game where that speedrunning experience would actually come in handy instead of on our slow city building game. Also, with any kind of direct report situation, you want to help them improve in areas where they're weak, but also let them show off a little bit too. So helping them set goals and follow up on those over the course of the year is paramount to success for your testers. So my speedrunning tester really didn't like testing our animation system because it was boring for her. So I helped her design a set of test cases that covered our animation system in our tactics game. And then later on in the week, she had time to test getting to the end of the game as quickly as possible, and found a lot of really weird edge cases there as well. I don't know what I just did. Yeah. So, oh my God, what am I doing? Here we go. With your direct reports, you also want to delegate tasks to them, but review the work. So this is really hard for me and many other people. You have to let go of total control with any kind of delegation. Your responsibilities will change the higher up the ladder you get, and people on your team will not always do everything exactly the way you would. The amount of review you'll need to do for their work will become less over time, but make sure to check in with advanced workers anyways, just to make sure they're doing okay. Also, bring your staff to meetings. So any meeting where your staff could be learning about the development process is fair game. So during those meetings, you should encourage them to contribute, and over time, let them do most of the talking. Take a step back from those meetings. And finally, for our initial QA team, you need to make it fun. Like I said before, you're gonna lose testers to other disciplines, which are more interesting if you don't make testing fun. So we used to do something called a QA exchange program, where the embedded QA for each project would take an afternoon or a day to go play test a different game at our studio. This means they get to take a fun break, the game they're testing gets new fresh eyes, everyone learns something, so it's a win-win. If you make it fulfilling to be in QA, the chances of retaining them as QA testers increases. Even with your own QA department, you're going to have to outsource some work at some point, so let's talk about outsourcing. It's important to note outsourcing is not a silver bullet to all your problems with your game quality. A lot of times when resources are spread thin, you will need more people. However, this can be a waste of time and money. So we had 2 early access games that had really long and intense early access periods. So almost 2.5 years of monthly updates, which is not a development schedule that I would recommend for most games. During that time, we had 5 external testers who were testing these games full time. So that's a lot of man hours for these games. For the most part, we benefited, but during times of development slowdown or like trying to figure out different features on the game that weren't working, a lot of the testers were just twiddling their thumbs, waiting for more work to come in, which ended up being a waste of money. So some good things in my experience to outsource for are compatibility testing, performance testing, and extra review before launches. So compatibility testing and performance testing, at a small studio or as an indie dev, you aren't gonna have the resources to test your game on a variety of different platforms, so outsourcing that is the best way forward. So while you have outsourced testers on staff, split your internal and external work effectively. So the examples I give on this slide are based on what we did with our early access games. I think our process will definitely evolve over the next year, especially now that my team is half the size it was. So I'm not 100% what that will look like, but this is what we've done in the past. So for our specific case, we were working with some lovely folks in Greece who were about 8 to 9 hours ahead of us. So our typical work split was we would write the test cases, attend meetings, and work directly with programmers to troubleshoot difficult issues. And then external QA would run the test cases, test the game generally, and provide specific feedback when asked. A lot of this was leaving instructions for testers for testing that day when we ended our day, and then we would receive a report in the morning when they ended their day. So very asynchronous, which was great because we had round-the-clock testing. Finally, remember to treat external testers as part of your team. So with a lot of external QA houses, their opportunities for career advancement can be very small. So extending a hand to them and treating them like they are developers as well is a really great way of giving back to the game development community. If you can, get them into your Slack and give them access to developers. So devs, programmers, I should say, will have better results with solving bugs if they can speak directly to the testers who are working on them. And it minimizes, for me, the amount of information flow I had to do between those testers and the developers, so I closed the gap between them. Also, when you like their work, you should tell their managers. So it takes 5 minutes every quarter to send an email to someone and say, hey, your workers are doing great. And positive client reviews can give significant boosts to their careers. Also, they have a lot of really good feedback about your game balance and just general quality of life features. So getting that feedback from them as quickly and easily as possible will be great for the quality of your game. I don't have a fun segue for this topic, so we'll just go into stretching your time and resources. So this has changed a lot because the studio is much smaller now. But as you grow, it's important to settle on essentials for new projects. So one of my must-haves, or used to be must-haves, was at least one dedicated QA resource per internal project. So at BYG, we went from 2 actively developed projects to like 6 or 7 projects in the span of 2 years. Not all of these have the same requirements or development strategy, so many of them were games that we're publishing. Internally, this is what worked for us during our early access period. It's changed significantly now. It's also important to make sure the expected QA support for external projects is clear to everybody. So setting boundaries early on and setting guidelines early on will help a lot. And obviously, not everything that people ask for with regards to testing is going to be possible, so being a part of finding a solution for those problems will be useful. If you can, getting ahead of things to propose tools or debug for a project will be a useful use of time. This means when you finally do have time to test, you'll be better set up for success. You also need to start dropping the ball strategically. So don't go to every meeting. Go once and then stop going, and then send someone else from your team. Read the meeting notes if they're available. Don't go to the meetings. It's fine. If you don't get information about what happened in the meeting, do follow up and find out why that information didn't arrive to you. And if you can, try and find the gap and help repair it. But you'll be too busy to go to every single meeting. You just shouldn't. You'll also want to keep a priority list. This is like basic stuff, but I didn't do this for the first 2 years of my career. So keep a to-do list. It does actually help. And then finally, you have to get your hands dirty sometimes. So again, like I've been saying this whole presentation, I used to just manage people, and now I've gone back to testing basically full-time. However, as a manager, my testing time, or my time is the last resource I have to fill testing hours. So this is difficult because I really love testing, but as a manager, it was no longer my primary responsibility. So most of my work is managing my team, talking to people, and writing test cases and compiling data. Typically, I would only jump in and test when there was a launch coming up or there was work overload balance and stuff like that. When it does happen, you need to analyze why you needed to test and help fill those testing hours. Like, was it a particular tough sprint, something go wrong in development, or was testing time or burden estimated incorrectly? Ultimately, doing the bare minimum or like easy wins are better than nothing. You might not be able to correct a heavy workload, especially if it's due to the development schedule, but verifying tickets for half an hour goes a long way. Part of helping reducing QA workload is making quality everyone's problem. So this might be a controversial slide. Getting some programmers invested in quality can be difficult, especially if they're coming from certain backgrounds where it was not common to dev test their work. So for all the indie devs out there, dev test your stuff before pushing it to your development build. Asking for a standard process in development can help for QA teams. This might be surprising. It's not a guarantee for small studios to see like commit syntax and stuff like that from their programming teams. So helping them understand why this is useful for them is the best way to do this. So explaining that not pushing a commit that breaks the build to development, that will prevent a day's worth of back and forths over a single ticket, which means you get more time to program and less time talking to me. Another great tool is regular playtests with the team. So these are great to do regularly, at least once a sprint. Sometimes you get too busy actually making the game to test it, so I think that's a really important thing to remember, is to playtest the stuff you're making as frequently as you possibly can. Studio management is also a big part of making quality important. So culture flows from the top. When you're trying to make a case for quality on the team level, try to resolve things, but let management know what you're doing. So management are typically more open to stepping in to help you if you have a plan for what you want to achieve, and specific questions about how to make it work. So if your attempts have become unproductive, then definitely call in management to talk about it. Having data to back up your case really helps a lot, so this will vary based on what you're trying to prove. I've used the number of player complaints about specific design and number of high severity bugs for a specific feature as talking points before. And finally, when you're pushing for quality at the studio, remember to be realistic. So done is better than perfect. That bug might seem really important in the moment, but make sure to step back and realize when it's not worth the dev effort or time. Also, no product is perfect. Accept this in your heart. There will always be a bug. A player will always find a bug that you didn't find, and it'll happen. You can't avoid it. Generally, important to QA is not the same as important to the project. So this applies to asking for tools, process, bug fixes. When you're working with many different disciplines, it's important to make sure your asks are serving the project as a whole. So if your dream tool costs a month to develop, maybe it's not such a good idea to push for when you're considering the whole project quality. And mistakes are still going to happen, so remember to be kind. Preserving the QA and programmer relationship is very important to keeping a project running smoothly. Everyone will make mistakes, and the shame and blame game is not going to make anyone's life easier. So, like I said earlier, diplomacy and empathy are key. All right, so here's a review of the topics that we just spoke about. In conclusion, these are the most important takeaways for me. So maintaining a big toolbox when you're testing strategies, different types of tests, outsourcing, etc., are all things that you'll find work for some things, but not for others. Being friendly and organized can help build your reputation at your studio as someone who can be relied on or respected, which will further your own QA work. Taking care of your team, both internal and external, will help you in the long run. So treat them nicely, they will treat you nicely. And finally, everyone, including yourself, are still going to make mistakes. Expect them to happen and enjoy them. Thank you for listening.
Questions. If you have a question,
Sorry, I know it was a very QA-specific talk. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for your talk. I think QA is really important as an engineer working on game dev projects and working with QA at various different studios. One thing that I found super helpful to the engineering team was educating QA on how the game actually works, because that allowed them to write more specific bugs and possibly give at least an idea or a theory on why the game is broken, which shortened the time for us to research why it's actually broken and fix it. Do you have any examples on, say, learning something from a dev about how the game works, like, oh, this is a raycast issue and the button's blocked from some image that you could speak to?
Are you looking for like a specific example? Yeah, okay. So we have one game called Phantom Brigade, which is extremely complicated, and a point of difficulty between QA and programming was that the systems in the game were often so difficult to understand that we were writing bugs that were completely unrelated to the actual problems at hand. I'm trying to think of a specific example that I can actually talk about. I don't have any specific examples, but I will say part of like nurturing that QA knowledge of how your game works is getting QA in working on the game as early as possible so that they understand the architecture of what you're creating as early as possible. So that way, you don't have QA coming in at the very end of the process writing like 100 bugs that don't actually apply to anything because they don't understand how the systems of your game work. So in QA circles, we call this the shift left mentality, where you're trying to get quality in as a goal of the game dev process as early in the process as possible. Is that cool? Sorry, I couldn't think of a specific example. If I think of one, I'll come back to it though.
Hi. So just one thing that I was curious, if you have any examples on the test cases, because I was particularly curious on the scope, like how big the scope is.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. So I had a test case sheet that was, it was like 50 tabs in Google Sheets, and each of those was like 200 lines long and like, I don't know, some insane number of columns. And it was just me and one other person who were testing at the time, so every time something changed, I had to go into the sheet and modify like 10 different tabs to make sure that everything worked. What we've settled on at BYG now is I use I use a web-based testing program called TestPad. And what we do is basically we take any design documents or feature tickets about how a feature is supposed to work or how design is supposed to be, basically like there are requirements for that to pass into playtesting, and then I write a basic checklist or spreadsheet based on those things. So I'm I don't know, making sure that you can do XYZ actions and making sure that this and this thing functions. And it doesn't have to be super in-depth, as long as you have like a checklist of all of the things that meet your criteria, your acceptance criteria. That's all it really needs to be. So we've definitely reduced the complexity of our test cases so that we can better test in an agile framework, which is the development strategy that we use at BYG. So we don't do waterfall style, we'll do agile style, which is a lot harder to do regular testing for because everything moves so much faster. So reducing the complexity, just using a basic spreadsheet to have like a checklist of all the different things that you'd want to check, and then doing exploratory testing for the rest has worked out fairly well for us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, you mentioned outsourcing PC compatibility testing as like a big win. I'm curious what processing that information looked like and how that worked on such a small team, considering those problems are probably hard to reproduce on your own.
So we didn't do the compatibility testing in-house. I'm not sure if that was clear in the presentation.
Oh, no, sorry, like, once you got the reports,
Oh, I
like,
see what you said.
how do you process what to fix?
So we worked with a company called Hyrule over in Montreal, and they basically, I wrote them a set of scenarios that I would like them to test that would measure specific things about the game. So we did this for our upcoming rhythm game. We have a visualizer in the background of that can be really difficult on certain PCs in terms of performance, like FPS dips and stuff, which you don't want in a rhythm game because it needs to be frame perfect so that you can get the perfects. So basically, we came up with them a set of loadouts basically for a PC, and then measured all of those loadouts over a set of criteria. So when the tests were done, I got basically a spreadsheet of all of the results that we had, and they also logged specific bugs when we got certain numbers under a certain threshold. So if the frame rate at any point went below 50, we immediately logged a bug about that for the specific area of the game and for how long and what the memory usage looked like and stuff like that. So then I could take that to the programming team and tell them, hey, here's where we're running into problems, and talk to the producer to figure out if A, we're even gonna fix them, since a lot of these systems that did run into the problems are like on the lower end of like user, what's the word I'm looking for? People don't use these things super often. Like it's not the majority of the player base. So lots of spreadsheets, lots of living in like ticket management systems.
Other questions?
One of your slides had a mention of commit syntax, and I didn't know if I understood that the same way that you understand that, possibly a terminology difference there. So could you explain what that was getting at?
Sure. I mean, not putting memes in your commits, in your commit messages. Like I don't know, I've gotten commits sometimes that are like, they contain words like LOL and stuff like that, which is funny, but when I'm reading back to figure out what you changed, it doesn't tell me very much. So that's what I mean by commit syntax. So if you're one guy and no one else is ever going to be looking at it, I guess it makes sense. But if you ever work with another person, it becomes very difficult because that's a really useful way to figure out what your partner did overnight on the game and why everything's broken. Instead of, I don't know, I've had people put in like, changed numbers. What does it mean? Which numbers did you change? I don't know. And then I have to go talk to them and say, hey, which numbers did you change? And then they tell me, oh, I don't remember. So that's what I mean by syntax for commits.
I also have a question. At what size of team do you think a studio should start thinking about hiring someone in-house to manage QA?
Let's see, I was hired around 20 people. I think it matters more depending on your development strategy. So a lot of people, a lot of smaller teams really have no choice but to do the waterfall style where you hire like a QA house later in development to really just throw a ton of people at it. I think there's a lot of benefit to getting QA in once you feel like your game is in a playable state and you want that feedback and consistent testing. Not to say that we replace developer testing, because I think that's still really important. Like as a dev, you should always be testing the things that you're doing. But I think it can be useful if you find yourself kind of getting stuck in the weeds over like really minute things on your project. So, yeah, I mean, it depends. It depends. I don't know. I think everyone should have QA. I don't think everyone can afford QA that early on for that size of studio.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, Noah again.
Sorry, follow up. Kind of 2 points, but sort of one. I haven't heard the word smoke test, although that's one that I've come to know quite familiar. I'm not sure if that's one that you use in-house.
I might know if I have a different name, please.
Just the very light version goes the whole game and make sure that
Smoke test, yes. I
Yeah,
heard
so-
smoke test and I was like, I don't know that one. Yeah, no, smoke tests are very useful, yes.
And then, in relation to that, how do you find dealing with the ability to go through the game with, let's say, automated test suites? So, just like a way that even a developer can write like a Unity test system that whenever they start the game up, it goes through those tests and make sure, I don't know, the data in the game wasn't broken by a designer working in a spreadsheet.
I would love to say that I love working with them, but I've never had someone make automated tests for me before. So it's something I'm working on at my studio to further and make sure that we are doing, but I have not had the pleasure of having unit tests written for a game I worked on before.
I have one more. As a community person, do you think it's good to include a bug reporting feature for players, like live public players?
We definitely had a lot of success with both of our early access games having an in-game bug reporting tool for reporting bugs for players. So what that did was it basically opened a forum in-game. You type up your thing, you hit the button send. It would send like the log and the save file and a bunch of other information, and then it would spit it into a Slack channel. And then also it would create a ticket in our ticketing system automatically. So saved QA a lot of time, since it meant I didn't have to read the Steam forums or the Discord to find out what kind of things players were running into. And it also meant that I had all of the information that I would need to send to a programmer to be able to fix the issue once I figured out reproduction steps and stuff like that. So if you have the resources to develop something like that, I think it can be really useful. But for 1.0 games, I don't know if you would find it as useful. For early access, I think it's really good though.
Okay, I lied, I have one more. What's the one thing that you'd wish other people on the dev team would do to make life easier for QA?
Test your work. Test it before you put it into develop. Please test your work.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Alexa.